January 1995. Grozny, a city located in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia. Once one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities of the Soviet Union, it has now turned into a hellscape. The city sky trembles with the deafening roar of Russian fighter jets and relentless artillery shelling. The streets are littered with the burning wreckage of Russian tanks and armored vehicles. Every building, every apartment block stands like a concrete skeleton, with death and destruction peeking out from the hollow sockets of their windows. This was the most horrific chapter of the First Chechen War, the Battle of Grozny. Russia's massive army, once known as one of the world's superpowers, found itself bogged down in the capital of a tiny republic within its own borders. Fighting against them was an incredibly brave but ruthless force of Chechen separatists. These fighters turned every alley, every pile of rubble into a fortress, transforming Grozny into a death trap for Russian soldiers. This war was a modern version of the battle between David and Goliath. On one side, nuclear-armed Russia. On the other, a small, independent-minded nation of the Caucasus Mountains. But the result stunned the world. Russia was humiliatingly defeated in this war, which was a naked exposure of Russia's weakness following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But why? Why did this tiny piece of land in the Caucasus become such a bloody and endless nightmare for Russia? What gave the Chechens the strength to continue their fight for freedom against some of the world's most powerful empires for centuries? And how did this nationalist struggle eventually transform into an unstoppable jihadist movement? We will try to find the answers to these complex and bloody questions in today's episode. Chechnya is a mountainous land in the North Caucasus region. Its rugged high mountains, deep valleys, and dense forests have shaped the character of its inhabitants for centuries. Chechens identify themselves as Nokchi, and their social system is completely distinct from the outside world. The foundation of their society is the teep or clan system. Every Chechen belongs to a specific teep, and loyalty to this clan is far more important to them than the state or anything else. This type system created a deep sense of unity and brotherhood among them, giving them incredible resilience against external enemies. From the beginning of history, Chechens have been known as a fiercely independent and warrior nation. In their culture, valor, honor, and freedom are valued more than life itself. To survive in this rugged mountain region, they had to struggle constantly, which bred an uncompromising attitude. Their conflict with Russia began in the 18th century, when Tsar Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great decided to expand the Russian Empire southward, towards the Caucasus. The Russian goal was to control the route to Persia and the Ottoman Empire, but the mountain nations of the Caucasus, especially the Chechens and Dagestanis, stood like an impenetrable wall in the path of their imperialist ambitions. Thus began a brutal and bloody war that lasted for nearly half a century, known in history as the Caucasian War, 1817 to 1864. In this war, the Muslim tribes of the Caucasus built an unequal but heroic resistance against the Russian Empire under the leadership of Imam Shamil. Imam Shamil was a charismatic and skilled military leader who held off the Tsar's massive army for nearly 25 years. The Chechens were the core strength of his struggle. They adopted guerrilla tactics that turned the Caucasus into a graveyard for the Russians. Finally, in 1859, Imam Shamil was forced to surrender. And by 1864, Russia completely conquered the Caucasus region. But this was a bloody victory. Russia managed to occupy the land, but they could never suppress the Chechen desire for freedom. This war birthed a deep and permanent hatred and mistrust of Russians in the minds of Chechens, which flowed through generations. The Caucasian War was the first spark that was destined to turn into a raging inferno in the 20th century. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the establishment of the Soviet Union brought new hope for the Chechens. They thought that after the end of Tsarist imperial rule, they might regain their long-awaited freedom. But that dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The Bolsheviks, who initially spoke of the right to self-determination for all nations, established a centralized and harsh rule just like the Tsars once they came to power. In the 1920s and 30s, Chechnya fell victim to Stalin's ruthless policies like other regions of the Soviet Union. Forced collectivization was imposed on them, which was completely incompatible with their traditional way of life. Furthermore, Islam was strictly suppressed and mosques were closed down. The Chechens rebelled against this several times, but the Soviet Red Army brutally crushed them each time. However, the darkest and most painful chapter in the history of the Chechen nation came during World War II. On February 23, 1944, Stalin issued a terrifying order. He accused the entire Chechen and neighboring Ingush nations of falsely collaborating with Nazi Germany and ordered their eviction from their homeland. The code name for this operation was Operation Lentil. Members of the NKVD, or Soviet Secret Police, surrounded Chechen villages and forced everyone, women, children, and the elderly, out of their homes at gunpoint. They were given only 20 minutes to pack their belongings. Then, they were herded like cattle into freight train wagons and sent into exile thousands of miles away to the cold, desolate steppes of Kazakhstan and Siberia in Central Asia. This journey was an indescribable horror. There was no provision for food or water in the overcrowded wagons. Thousands died on the way from cold, hunger, and disease. For those who reached the destination, a grimmer future awaited. In the new and hostile environment, they had no shelter or livelihood. About 500,000 Chechens and Ingush were evicted in this deportation. It is estimated that about 1/4 to 1/3 of them died within the first few years of this exile. It was an indescribable genocide and ethnic cleansing. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev allowed the Chechens to return to their homeland in 1957. But when they returned, they found that their homes and lands had been settled by Russians and people of other ethnic groups. This event birthed renewed tension and conflict between the two communities. This deportation of 1944, known to Chechens as Ardak, remained a deep and irreparable wound in their memory. It cemented their hatred and distrust of Moscow forever. To them, it was strong proof that the Russian state did not even want to acknowledge their existence. This trauma and sense of deprivation transformed their struggle for freedom in the 1990s into an unstoppable force. In August 1991, the failed hardliner coup against Gorbachev in the Soviet Union drove the final nail into the coffin of the Soviet Empire. Taking advantage of the central government's weakness, various republics of the Soviet Union began declaring their independence one by one. This wave reached Chechnya as well. At this time, Jokhar Dudayev, a former Air Force general of the Soviet Air Force, appeared on the political stage of Chechnya. Dudayev was a charismatic and determined nationalist leader. He embodied the Chechen desire for independence. In October 1991, Dudayev was elected president of Chechnya, and shortly thereafter, he unilaterally declared Chechnya's independence as the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. In Moscow, the new Russian Federation was being formed under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had accepted the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he was not willing to compromise on the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Chechnya, unlike the Union republics, was an autonomous republic within the Russian Federation. Therefore, Yeltsin's government never recognized Chechnya's independence. Their fear was that if Chechnya were given independence, other ethnic regions of Russia, such as Tatarstan or Dagestan, would also demand independence, causing the entire federation to collapse. A domino effect. Moreover, Chechnya's strategic importance was immense. For Russia, the only pipeline to transport oil and gas from the Caspian Sea through the Caucasus Mountains to the Black Sea ran through Chechnya. Russia was absolutely not ready to lose this economic lifeline. For the next 3 years, Moscow hatched various covert conspiracies to destabilize Dudayev's government. They tried to trigger a civil war by supporting internal opposition forces in Chechnya with arms and money. But due to widespread public support for Dudayev, these efforts failed every time. Finally, in December 1994, Boris Yeltsin decided on direct military intervention in Chechnya. Russian Defense Minister Pavel Grachev boasted that it is possible to take Grozny in a couple of hours with just one airborne regiment. But this was a fatal miscalculation. On December 11, 1994, the Russian army entered Chechnya from 3 directions. They thought it would be a small and easy operation to restore constitutional order. But what they got was an all-out and brutal war. Chechen fighters, who knew every inch of their homeland and were ready to give their lives for freedom, began launching surprise guerrilla attacks on Russian soldiers. The most horrific chapter of the war was the Russian assault on Grozny on New Year's Eve, 1994-95. Inexperienced and psychologically unprepared Russian soldiers were sent into the city center in columns of armored vehicles, which was a suicidal tactic. Chechen fighters, many of whom had combat experience in the Soviet army, destroyed Russian tanks and armored vehicles one after another using RPGs or rocket-propelled grenades from the basements and roofs of high-rise buildings. The streets of Grozny turned into a burning graveyard for Russian soldiers. After weeks of fierce fighting, the Russians managed to capture Grozny. They practically razed the city to the ground, but even though they captured the city, they could not break the Chechen resistance. The war spread to Chechnya's countryside and mountainous regions. In this war, the Russian army committed massive human rights violations. Allegations arose of indiscriminate bombing of civilians, extrajudicial killings, and torture of prisoners in filtration camps. On the other hand, Chechen fighters led by commanders like Shamil also resorted to cruelty. In 1995, Basayev took hundreds hostage at a hospital in the Russian city of Budyannovsk, taking the war beyond Chechnya's borders. Finally, after 21 months of bloody warfare, in August 1996, Chechen fighters recaptured Grozny in a daring counterattack. The battered and demoralized Russian army was forced to retreat. Subsequently, mediated by influential Russian politician Alexander Lebed, the Khasav-Yurt Accord was signed. According to this agreement, Russian troops were withdrawn from Chechnya, and the issue of Chechnya's final political status was deferred for 5 years. This was an absolute and humiliating defeat for Russia. The defeat of one of the world's largest armies by a tiny republic exposed Russia's weakness to the world. On the other hand, for the Chechens, it was a massive victory. They had effectively achieved independence, but this freedom came at a terrible price: the lives of approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people and a completely devastated country. While victory in the First Chechen War brought de facto independence for the Chechens, it did not bring peace or stability. The 3-year interwar period from 1996 to 1999 was a time of chaos, anarchy, and ideological shift for Chechnya. The nationalist spirit upon which the struggle for independence began slowly started losing ground to a radical religious ideology. The economy of war-torn Chechnya was completely destroyed. There was no industry, no jobs. The capital, Grozny, was a pile of rubble. In this situation, the governance of the country fell into the hands of various warlords who had gained fame during the war. The elected president Aslan Maskhadov's central government had virtually no control over the country. Each warlord ruled their own territory with their private militia. Due to the lack of an economy, Chechnya's main industry became crime. Kidnapping for ransom, stealing oil to sell on the black market, and arms smuggling became daily occurrences. Businessmen and journalists were even kidnapped from various regions of Russia and brought to Chechnya. This lawlessness and insecurity forced the international community to turn away from Chechnya. No country officially recognized the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Amidst this political and economic vacuum, a new force emerged in Chechnya: Wahhabi or Salafi jihadism. During the war, many foreign mujahideen from the Arab world, many of whom were veterans of the Afghan-Soviet War, came to fight in Chechnya. Their leader was a Saudi Arabian jihadist known as Khattab. They brought with them vast amounts of money and an uncompromising religious ideology. These foreign jihadists and their local followers, including influential commanders like Shamil began promoting a concept of global jihad instead of Chechnya's traditional Sufi Islam. Their goal was not just the independence of Chechnya, but the establishment of an Islamic emirate across the entire North Caucasus. They labeled the secular nationalist government of elected President Maskhadov as infidels and pressured for the establishment of Sharia law. This ideological conflict divided Chechen society from within. On one side were traditional nationalists like Maskhadov, who wanted an independent but secular Chechen state. On the other were Islamists like Basayev and Kadyrov, who wanted to turn Chechnya into a new front for global jihad. The ultimate manifestation of this internal conflict occurred in August 1999. A force of about 1,500 Chechen and foreign fighters, led by Shamil and Kadyrov, invaded the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan. Their objective was to incite a rebellion there and complete the first step of establishing their Islamic state in the Caucasus. This attack on Dagestan was the final warning for Russia. A new and hardline leader was rising in Moscow at that time, Vladimir Putin. This anarchy in Chechnya and the rise of jihadists gave Putin a golden opportunity to re-establish full Russian control over Chechnya. The fleeting and bloody dream of Chechen independence was then nearing its end. Basayev's attack on Dagestan broke the dam of Russia's patience. Exactly at that time, in September 1999, horrific bomb blasts occurred in apartment buildings in several Russian cities: Moscow, Volgodonsk, and Buynaksk, killing about 300 ordinary people. The Russian government blamed Chechen jihadists for this, without any clear evidence. Although many, even critics within Russia, believe these explosions were a false flag operation by Russia's own security agency, the FSB, intended to create a pretext for restarting the war in Chechnya. Whatever the cause, these bomb blasts created intense anger and fear among the Russian public. The then Prime Minister, and soon-to-be President Vladimir Putin, harnessed this public outrage. He emerged as a tough and uncompromising leader and vowed to hunt down the terrorists and finish them. In October 1999, Russia launched an all-out invasion of Chechnya under the guise of an anti-terrorist operation, known in history as the Second Chechen War. Learning from the mistakes of the First War, this time the Russian army was much more organized, coordinated, and ruthless. Before the ground invasion, they carried out air and artillery strikes on Chechen cities and villages for weeks, turning them into rubble. By February 2000, after a long and bloody siege, Russian forces regained control of Grozny. President Maskhadov and key separatist leaders fled to the mountainous regions to continue guerrilla warfare. But this time, Russia's strategy was different. They did not stop at just using military force. They also tried to find a political solution, which was the policy of Chechenization. The core of this policy was controlling Chechens using Chechens. Putin joined hands with those Chechen leaders who were willing to oppose separatism and remain loyal to Moscow. Putin first chose Ahmad Kadyrov. Kadyrov was the Grand Mufti of Chechnya and had fought against Russia in the First Chechen War. But he became alarmed by the rise of Wahhabi jihadists during the Interwar period, and during the Second War, he decided to side with Russia along with his loyal militia. Putin appointed Kadyrov as the head of the pro-Russian administration in Chechnya. In return, Kadyrov and his loyal forces, known as the Kadyrovtsi, gained almost exclusive power to control Chechnya's internal security. Their job was to hunt down and eliminate separatist guerrillas. Through Putin's maneuvering, this eventually turned into a Chechen civil war, where one group of Chechens began killing another group with Moscow's support. This strategy was extremely effective. The Kadyrovtsi, who knew the local terrain and clan system, were able to suppress the guerrillas far more successfully than the Russian army. When Ahmad Kadyrov was killed in a bomb attack in 2004, Putin replaced him with his son, Ramzan Kadyrov. Ramzan Kadyrov was even more efficient and ambitious than his father. With endless money and political support from Moscow, He established a reign of terror and repression in Chechnya. His private army began kidnapping, torturing, and killing separatists, human rights activists, journalists, and any critics of his rule. By 2009, the main separatist resistance in Chechnya was almost completely destroyed, and Russia officially declared the end of their anti-terrorist operation in Chechnya. The war ended, but a new and more complex chapter began for Chechnya. If you visit the Chechen capital Grozny today, you might not believe your eyes. The city that was a metropolis of rubble just 2 decades ago has now turned into a gleaming, modern metropolis. Massive glass skyscrapers, one of Europe's largest mosques, wide boulevards, and luxurious shopping malls. Everything signals a new and prosperous Chechnya. This is the peace established by Ramzan Kadyrov. Using billions of dollars from Moscow's federal budget, Kadyrov has rebuilt Chechnya. Outwardly, stability prevails in Chechnya. There are no gunfights on the streets, no bomb blasts. But hidden behind this apparent peace is a grim reality. Under Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechnya has effectively turned into a personal feudal fiefdom within the Russian Federation, where Kadyrov's word is law, not Russia's. He has established a personality-centric dictatorship that survives on strict rule and loyalty. According to reports by international human rights organizations, Kadyrov's security force, the Kadyrovtsi, regularly commits crimes like extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture. The slightest criticism of his rule is not tolerated. Human rights activists, independent journalists, and even ordinary people who make adverse comments on social media disappear. The horrific torture of the LGBT community in Chechnya has repeatedly surfaced in international media. Kadyrov has imposed his own strict, traditional Sufi version of Islam in Chechnya under state patronage, which is completely opposed to Wahhabism. Wearing the hijab has been made mandatory for women, and many elements of Sharia law have been applied in society, which conflicts with the Russian constitution. However, for Vladimir Putin, this arrangement is extremely convenient. In exchange for giving Kadyrov endless money and freedom, Putin has ensured 2 things. 1. Separatism in Chechnya has been crushed with an iron hand, and 2. Kadyrov demonstrates absolute loyalty to Putin. Kadyrov introduces himself as Putin's foot soldier and does not think twice about sending his forces for any of Russia's needs, such as the war in Ukraine. Therefore, the peace that prevails in Chechnya today is not a democratic peace. It is a fragile stability built on fear and repression. The desire for freedom, which runs in Chechen blood, may be dormant for now, but it has not been completely extinguished. Behind the iron curtain of Kadyrov's rule, this volatile land of the Caucasus might be silently waiting for a new explosion in the future. The history of Chechnya is a tale of endless tragedy. It is the story of a nation ready to pay any price for its freedom, and the story of an empire that can resort to any cruelty to protect the integrity of its territory. For Chechens, their identity, honor, and existence are inextricably linked with the independence of their motherland. To them, remaining under Russia means accepting the memory of centuries of oppression, humiliation, and genocide. On the other hand, for Russia, Chechnya is a crucial symbol of its sovereignty and the key to its strategic control in the Caucasus. To them, letting go of Chechnya means admitting weakness and encouraging a dangerous separatist trend that could threaten the entire federation. The collision of these 2 contradictory desires turned Chechnya into a bloody battlefield. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought them a fleeting opportunity for freedom, but internal chaos and the rise of jihadists turned that dream into a nightmare. The rise of Vladimir Putin and the policy of Chechenization may have ended the war, but it has buried the Chechen desire for freedom under a ruthless dictatorship. Today's Chechnya may be quiet, but it is not free. This volatile little territory in the Caucasus reminds us that while the desire for a nation's freedom may be temporarily suppressed by force and money, it is almost impossible to extinguish it completely.